Okay, hi everyone. Thanks to all of you for attending today, and thanks to the conveners for the invitation to speak in this conference. This talk summarizes the results of fun and productive collaboration over the past couple of months with Roland Bergman, where we tried to think carefully about how we can link geophysical observations of slow slip transients in modern subduction zones to geological observations from analog exhumed rocks in the field. And so what I'm going to show today is based on a manuscript we wrote up with this purpose. It's currently under review from the Royal Society Philosophical Transactions A as part of the conference volume on the geologic record of earthquakes. And we'd certainly welcome feedback from this audience, and I look forward to discussions that we can have here regarding transient deformation processes. So I'll start by highlighting some of the key aspects of ETS from geophysics, focusing on those that are somehow scalable or relevant to things we can look at in exhumed analogs. And these will include, firstly, the environment of slow slip as constrained mainly by geophysical imaging, and secondly, the spatiotemporal characteristics of slow slip as constrained by both geodetic measurements and earthquake seismology. And then I'll switch gears to considering what the rocks tell us and speculate on what some of the features that we see in the rocks might correspond to in modern subduction zones. This map highlights both the modern distribution of deep ETS events, which are concentrated in subduction zones mainly around the Pacific, but that also occur at deep levels of strike-slip faults, such as the San Andreas Fault. And the map also shows exhumed blue schist and eclogite facies, subduction complexes, or metamorphic belts, some of which have been recently studied from the point of view of transient deformation processes, and that I'll be drawing some examples from. So starting first with environment, this is a nice example from the Tokai district in central Japan. These are figures from Kato and others, 2010. And the first thing to point out is just the spatial distribution of slow slip, shown in blue, contours, versus tremor or low frequency earthquakes, which are shown in green. Both occur down dip of the locked megathrust, with the slow slip region from this particular event extending farther up dip and less distance along strike than the observed LFEs. And then when we look in cross-section at features constrained by seismic velocities, on the bottom right, receiver functions highlight the major velocity contrasts here and define the upper plate and lower plate MOHOs along with the interface itself. And these show that the slow slip event is occurring essentially along the interface near the mantle wedge corner. And then in terms of seismic velocities, we find that this part of the interface corresponds with both a low seismic velocity layer, shown in the upper right, and a region of anomalously high VP to VS ratios, shown in the center right. From experiments, these values of VP/VS are only really compatible with both high fluid content and near lithostatic fluid pressures. And this observation of ETS events appearing to correlate with low velocity layers in subduction zones as well as high VP/VS ratio regions is not unique to Japan, but is also recognized in several other subduction zones that host ETS. So the interpretation from this paper was, as in the sketch in the lower left, that there's some downgoing plate heterogeneity associated with a subducted oceanic ridge, and that's coupled with an upper plate cap rock that seals fluids in and defines the slow slip zone. LFEs occur within that slow slip zone, but are concentrated more down dip, where fluids start to drain into the sort of spongy, partially serpentinized mantle wedge. So now let's look a little bit at some of the spatiotemporal characteristics. This is a neat plot from Michel and others for Cascadia with time on the x-axis and latitude on the y-axis. And it shows the along strike distribution of both low frequency earthquakes, the black dots, and slow slip events through time, which are the regions colored by slip rate. And there are a couple of key things to notice. Firstly, the LFEs define streaks or lineaments in the along strike direction that light up repeatedly and recur quite rapidly on essentially a daily or several day basis, and they do not have to be accompanied at all by slow slip. And then secondly, the slow slip events also define along strike streaks that repeat over time, but their recurrence intervals are longer, more on the order of months or multiple months, and they're typically overlapping with or accompanied by low frequency earthquakes. So then here's a figure from Armbruster and others also for Cascadia events during the interval 2003 to 2004, but zoomed in now on some of the LFE distributions. And here we see they also show a streaking type pattern, but in this case, it's actually in the down dip direction, in the direction of convergence toward the northeast. And those same streaks light up in recurring events, suggesting they define some sort of persistent heterogeneous patch that's occupying the interface here. And then finally, we can zoom in at the scale of tens of kilometers, and we see that individual LFEs define small patches or families of 1 to 2 kilometers in length or width. So there's clearly a hierarchy of spatial distributions defined at the minimum scale of a kilometer or so, but ultimately these have to connect up to produce large magnitude up to magnitude 6 or 7 aseismic slow slip events like those that are documented from geodesy. So based on observations like those that I just highlighted, the view from geophysics has developed into something like shown schematically here. There's this general concept of a heterogeneous fault plane where the locked part of the megathrust hosts very large asperities, tens to hundreds of kilometers in dimension, but that down dip, these asperities are smaller and fewer on the order of kilometers, and they define patches or streaks both along strike and down dip. There's also a lot of evidence that the environment is very fluid rich and involves high fluid pressures. And there's evidence for two distinct spatiotemporal event patterns, LFEs, which represent thousands of small seismically detectable events recurring daily, and slow slip, which are much larger aseismic geodetically detected events that are recurring over several months. So that's a very quick and, of course, oversimplified summary of some key aspects of ETS from the view of geophysics in modern subduction zones. So then the question becomes, what comparisons can we make to the rock record, or what are some of the related questions that we can pose as geologists to try to better understand this interesting phenomenon? And so here I've tried to frame some of these key questions. When it comes to heterogeneity, we can examine the rocks to try and understand the typical length scales and types of heterogeneities that occupy the deep interface. In other words, or for example, what are the rock types that actually produce rheological and or permeability contrasts? In terms of fluids, we can try to investigate how fluids are transported and how fluids become trapped such that fluid pressures can start to increase toward lithostatic values. And in terms of trying to match the spatiotemporal characteristics of ETS, this is really quite challenging because geologic features are notoriously difficult to interpret when it comes to rates. But we can at least look for examples of captured transient deformation processes or features that deformed faster than the background steady state and try to speculate on how those events could scale both spatially and temporally with LFEs and or slow slip. So I'm now going to spend the rest of this talk discussing some of these aspects from the geology, drawing from ongoing and published work. But I just want to point out that these are all open questions at this stage and avenues of a lot of active and exciting research, including ongoing work from several of you in the audience today. So first, we can address this issue of heterogeneity. The rock record indicates that the deep subduction interface is a rich source of lithological heterogeneity, and this is mainly due to the process of underplating, where fragments of the downgoing slab and potentially upper plate fork become sliced off and accreted to the upper plate, especially in the deeper parts of accretionary margins. This is an example from numerical models that Jonas Rue and others conducted, showing how slices of oceanic crust and mantle can be slivered off, and the active interface can step progressively downward with time from one rheologically weak material to another structurally deeper rheologically weak material. Many different rock types become juxtaposed in this environment, including sediments, mafic oceanic crust, and slivers of partially serpentinized mantle that can either be derived from the downgoing slab or eroded from the upper plate forearc. When we look at these underplated materials on the deep interface, we often find that these lithological heterogeneities produce characteristic rheological heterogeneities, where strain is strongly concentrated into sediment or serpentine-rich shear zones or melange belts, because those materials are much weaker than their mafic counterparts. Here's a somewhat classic example from the blue schist and eclogite facies Monviso complex in the Western Alps. This is a schematic sketch map and cross-section of the complex, and it illustrates how several multi-kilometer scale sediment, mafic oceanic crust, and mantle slices are stacked due to progressive underplating. The mafic oceanic crust units here tend to form coherent slab-like slivers that are only weakly deformed and preserve original igneous textures, whereas strain is concentrated primarily into half a kilometer or so thick chlorite serpentinite shear zones. The base of this sequence also involves strongly deformed metasediments with broadly distributed deformation within them. And then if we look in more detail at the chlorite serpentinite shear zones themselves, we see there's additional heterogeneity preserved at a smaller scale with entrained blocks of eclogite, massive serpentinites, or metabasaltic chunks, again just reflecting the same rheological contrasts that are observed at the larger scale between these different rock types. So this is just one example of kilometer scale heterogeneity within a deeply exhumed subduction complex, but the map patterns of many other complexes reveal similar scales of lithological and rheological heterogeneity, and these have the potential to be analogs for the persistent kilometer scale patches that characterize the length scales of low frequency earthquakes. So now let's consider what the high strain subduction interface shear zones, like those preserved in metasedimentary and serpentinite melanges, as in the Monviso example, and as in many other examples, what can they tell us about transient deformation processes and mechanics? So I should first, with full disclosure, point out that most of the high strain rocks on the deep subduction interface record millions of years of accumulated finite strain, which means that they're mostly telling us about viscous deformation more relevant to long-term geodynamic processes rather than strain transients. This is an example from the Condry Mountain window in the Klamath Mountains. This is a blue schist terrain similar in age and context to the Franciscan complex. This massif on the image on the left consists of isoclinally folded deep marine metasediments and intercalated fine-grained metabasalts. The original contact between those units was probably a thrust fault, but now that discrete structure has been smeared and transposed through several stages of folding and deformation. That said, though, one of the things that stands out even in polydeformed viscous rocks like these is the preservation of multiple generations of veins that we think were likely in place fairly rapidly and under dominantly frictional conditions at high fluid pressures, but that are repeatedly entrained and dismembered by ongoing viscous creep processes. So we see even in these high strain rocks, some cryptic evidence for an interplay between frictional and viscous deformation that must have switched off in repeated cycles through time. And there are now several outcrops described where we can sort of catch this transient frictional viscous deformation process in the act. Here's an example from a green schist facies melange shear zone in Japan from Uji and others, 2018. And it shows this nice relationship between viscous foliation development via pressure solution creep and incremental vein opening and precipitation or healing. The veins are in place brittlely and then subsequently viscously deformed and rotated in the direction of finite strain, so that's why some are at higher angles to the foliation than others. In some cases, these veins will preserve microstructural evidence of each opening increment in the form of cracked seal textures as shown here in the image on the right. And you can see in this image that each displacement increment is on the order of about 0.05 millimeters. And as I'll show in a few minutes, that's a displacement value that we can actually compare to displacement estimates from LFEs. On a Moore circle diagram, these types of structures indicate transient increases in fluid pressures at low differential stresses that pushes more circle to the left until extensional or dilational shear fractures can open and temporarily release the fluid pressure, and then the cycle starts all over again. Here's another example from a shallow subduction interface shear zone in New Zealand from Aki Foggering's 2010 paper. And this is an example of viscous shear that's developed on weak phyllosilicate cleavage planes that is then kinematically linked and potentially rate limited by extensional fracturing and vein opening approximately perpendicular to those cleavage planes. And so this is, again, another example reflecting simultaneous frictional viscous deformation under conditions of low differential stress and high pore fluid pressures. Those two examples are from the shallow interface, but I'll just point out that we also see evidence for the same process of cyclical frictional viscous deformation, even at much higher confining pressures and higher pressure temperature conditions. In this case, is an example of the deep interface at blue schist and eclogite facies conditions. This is from Alyssa Kotowski's work on the cycladic blue schist unit on Syros Island in Greece. This is a block and matrix type shear zone where the blocks are all mafic eclogites and the matrix is fine-grained blue schists and quartz schists. And the eclogites concentrate brittle shear strain both on their flanks and in their interiors. And the quartz veins highlighted here show the same types of incremental emplacement features as in the Japan example, where veins are opened in the extension direction perpendicular to signal 1 and then are gradually rotated by viscous shear in the direction of finite strain. There's also evidence from this outcrop of simultaneous rather than alternating frictional viscous deformation. This image shows brittle dilational shear fractures that are developed in the rigid eclogites, and those are glaucophane bearing so that we know they're occurring under blue schist facies conditions, but then those brittle fractures soul outward into the surrounding weaker matrix into more distributed viscous deformation. So one of the questions we can then ask in observing these transient brittle features is whether they scale reasonably with anything that seismologists observe in modern subduction zones. And one way we can attempt to answer this is to look at the components that define seismic moment or moment magnitude, which include the amount of displacement and the area over which that displacement was accommodated. And source areas and displacements have been broken down or calculated for some modern low frequency earthquakes, the results of which are plotted here. Many of these are from Cascadia. And what this shows is that the source areas are typically on the order of 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 6 square meters, and displacements are generally between about 0.01 to 2 millimeters, representing very small magnitude earthquakes. And it turns out we can try to estimate these same values, displacement and source area, from exhumed rocks. Displacement increments, of course, come from offset features, vein opening widths, and or crack seal textures. And although individually each of these features accommodating displacement are small, typically on the microscale to a maximum of meter scale, they tend to occur in clusters or heterogeneous patches that occupy much larger areas. So I kind of envision them as something like the sketch on the right, where you have a heterogeneous lens that's smeared out on the interface, sort of a frictional viscous disparity that contains frictional sublenses within it that record the displacement magnitude that's distributed over this area. So we can use these map scale features like that to estimate the source areas that are occupied by these small displacement events, with the idea that the events are able to communicate with each other across the heterogeneous frictional viscous patch. Now, if we superimpose estimates of displacement and area from fossil subduction interface rocks onto the estimates for modern subduction zones, we find that many of them do in fact overlap with the small displacements in kilometer-scale shear zone areas expected for LFEs. Of course, there are some features, like those in the upper right, that record displacements that are too large. Perhaps they represent regular earthquakes, or perhaps they're recording multiple slip events on a single slip surface. But to first order, it's intriguing that there's actually a pretty decent match between these patches that host frictional viscous deformation in exhumed rocks and the estimates of seismic moments modeled for low frequency earthquakes. Another question we can raise is how these features should scale to LFEs or ETS events in time. And Although we can't really assess the slip rate on individual structures, besides to say that they're faster than steady state creep, we can at least consider that one of the primary rate limiting components in these frictional viscous systems should be vane precipitation or vane healing and sealing. This process of healing and sealing has been looked at for minerals like quartz, both theoretically and experimentally, but unfortunately, from the literature that I reviewed at least, estimates of healing times appear to vary by several orders of magnitude, from timescales of hours to timescales of tens to hundreds of years for temperatures representative of the deep interface. Here I'm just showing two end-member examples. On the left is a suite of laboratory experiments by Brantley and others, which shows vane precipitation of several microns on timescales of hours for temperatures in the range of about 400 to 600 degrees C. So this would suggest that vane healing could potentially match the timescales of LFE recurrence intervals. On the right, though, I'm showing a plot from Fisher and others in which they used a kinetic model with including taking into account different rate controlling mechanisms to infer sealing times, and then they plotted those up for typical subduction geothermal gradients. And in the case of their models, even for a quite warm subduction zone like Cascadia, the maximum sealing times are on the order of 10 to 100 years for the deep interface or the ETS source region, which are much too long to match either LFE or ETS recurrence, but perhaps are more consistent with regular megathrust earthquake recurrence intervals. So this is an aspect, I think, that we need a lot more constraints, both from the lab and from nature, on healing and vane precipitation rates. The last thing I want to do before I wrap up is just discuss a couple of quick points with respect to fluid sources and permeability. There are two key points I want to make. One is there's a very clear interplay in this deep subduction environment between fluids associated with metamorphic reactions and the activity of transient deformation features in the rock record. There are now several reported examples of this, but I'm highlighting one here from Matthew Tarling's recent paper in Nature Geoscience from the Livingston Fault in New Zealand, which represents a mantle wedge type setting. And he documented several nice examples of mutually cross-cutting relationships, dilational, shear slip surfaces, as well as purely dilational fractures. And these are all associated with serpentinite and related mineral reaction products. So this suggests that metamorphic reactions and associated fluid exchange is driving high fluid pressures and then also drives cyclical brittle shear slip. And then the other key point regarding fluids is that there's abundant evidence that fluid flow concentrates into sheared rocks or melanges, but is suppressed in underplated, weakly deformed mafic slabs. Furthermore, permeability experiments suggest that melange belts have highly anisotropic permeabilities due to their strong foliations. This work shown in the figure on the left from Kawano and others on serpentinite shows that permeability can be up to 2 orders of magnitude higher parallel to foliation than perpendicular to it. So this implies that fluids in melange belts will be driven parallel to the slab interface, or essentially up dip, rather than permeating vertically. And then the diagrams on the right are showing models of fluid migration in melange belts that Jay Agu did based on outcrops from cirrus. And they show how both rigid melange blocks or mafic lineaments should strongly influence both fluid flux and fluid flow vectors, such that fluids, again, are channeled parallel to the foliation. So these examples just get across the notion that mafic lenses or blocks and associated high strain shear zones around them are not only rheologically distinct features on the interface, but they should also greatly influence patterns of fluid flux and flow pathways. And then, of course, that will feed back to influence their rheology as well. So to summarize, this is our view of the ETS source region as based on the geologic record. It shares some similarities and some differences to the summary view that I showed before from geophysics. We envision the subduction megathrust widens downward around the ETS source depth into a distributed frictional viscous shear zone. This is a region of deep underplating where several fragments or slices of the downgoing slab become stranded. These produce heterogeneous patches along the deep interface. The primary source of rheological heterogeneity is in the form of brittle, impermeable mafic lenses often surrounded by mixed mode melange belts that are fluid rich and that host high fluid pressures. And these paired mafic lenses and melange belts can form lineaments in both the along strike and down dip directions, and they appear to scale reasonably well with the inferred size of low frequency earthquakes. ETS events in this scenario would then need to represent the communication of these LFE producing patches over much larger spatial scales. The mechanisms by which this communication could occur, for example, viscoelastic interactions, porosity waves, some form of fast viscous creep, frictional faulting, etc., these mechanisms are poorly understood, but our hope is that perhaps these combined observations from the geologic and geophysical records will help us to build some new observation-based models that help capture this behavior. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.